The bomber was flying far too low. At just 200 feet above the water, the aircraft screamed toward the enemy convoy, its engines straining, its pilot staring straight into a wall of anti-aircraft fire. Naval gunners were trained for high-altitude attacks, graceful arcs of bombs falling from the sky. This was different. If the bomb was released even a second too late, it would slam straight into the sea and vanish. Too early, and it would skip wildly or strike the water at the wrong angle. There would be no second pass. Below, Japanese transport ships surged forward, packed with thousands of soldiers bound for New Guinea. Above, Allied command had already accepted grim odds. What happened next would annihilate an entire convoy and quietly revolutionize how air forces sank ships for the rest of the war. By early 1943, the war in the Pacific had reached a critical logistical breaking point. Japan's ability to hold territory depended not on battleships or carriers, but on transport ships. Troops, fuel, ammunition, food, and vehicles had to move across vast ocean distances, often under constant threat from Allied aircraft and submarines. The Allies knew this, but stopping those convoys proved maddeningly difficult. Traditional bombing methods were failing. High-altitude bombing, safe for crews, was disastrously inaccurate against moving ships. Bombs fell behind targets, detonated harmlessly in the sea, or missed entirely. Even large formations struggled to score direct hits. Torpedoes offered another option, but they were slow, expensive, and vulnerable to defensive maneuvers. Japanese escorts learned to spot and evade them. Submarines stretched thin, could not cover every route. Statistics exposed the failure. Throughout 1942, Japanese convoys continued to reach their destinations despite repeated Allied air attacks. Troops arrived intact. Supplies flowed. Entire campaigns in New Guinea were sustained by ships that should have been sunk. Allied commanders faced an uncomfortable truth. They could see the enemy, but they could not reliably stop him. And then came a radical idea that violated everything bomber crews had been taught. Instead of dropping bombs from safety, what if they threw them? The solution did not come from senior admirals or aircraft designers. It came from pilots willing to fly straight into gunfire, so low that waves brushed their wings. They would attack ships the way children skip stones across a pond. And in March 1943, they would put that idea to the ultimate test. The idea sounded reckless because, by every rule of air warfare, it was. For years, bomber crews were trained to fly high. Altitude meant safety. Altitude meant time. Altitude meant survival. Bombs were engineered to fall straight down, relying on gravity, mathematics, and formation discipline to do the work. But over the Pacific, gravity was betraying them. By late 1942, Allied airmen operating from Australia and New Guinea faced a humiliating pattern. They could spot Japanese convoys with ease. They could reach them. They could bomb them. And still, the ships kept sailing. Reports from 5th Air Force intelligence showed that high-altitude bombing against moving ships had hit rates often below 5%. Even when bombs landed close, the concussive effect against modern steel hulls was limited. Near misses looked dramatic, but they rarely sank ships. Something had to change. The breakthrough came not from a laboratory, but from experimentation in the field. Pilots adapting tactics out of frustration. Some crews began flying lower than regulations allowed. Others delayed bomb release, flattening trajectories unintentionally. Then someone noticed something critical. When a bomb struck the water at a shallow angle, it didn't always sink. It skipped. Like a stone tossed across a lake, the bomb could ricochet forward, slam into the side of a ship at the waterline, and detonate where armor was thinnest. The concept wasn't entirely new. The Royal Air Force had experimented with low-level attacks in Europe, but no one had applied the method systematically against shipping, and certainly not in the Pacific, where distances were vast and defenses intense. Enter Major Paul, Pappy, Gunn, a former airline pilot turned battlefield innovator. Gunn had already modified aircraft with heavier guns and improved range. He believed aircrews were being constrained by doctrine, that no longer matched reality. Gun pushed for low-level attack training, teaching pilots to approach at mast height, sometimes as low as 50 to 100 feet, and release bombs so late they nearly clipped the water. The risks were obvious. Anti-aircraft fire at that altitude was devastating. There was no room to evade. A single hit could tear an aircraft apart. Bombs that failed to skip correctly could bounce backward into the attacking plane. But the logic was undeniable. Japanese ships had limited horizontal armor. Their gunners were trained for high-angle fire. And most importantly, they did not expect aircraft to attack like torpedo boats, without torpedoes. Skip bombing turned bombers into blunt instruments of shock. And now, the Allies needed a chance to test it at full scale. Convincing commanders was harder than convincing pilots. Senior officers worried about losses. Bombers were expensive. Crews took months to train. Flying straight into concentrated anti-aircraft fire ran counter to every instinct shaped by early war losses. Some labeled the tactic cowboy flying. Others dismissed it as a desperation move suitable only for isolated experiments. But the situation forced their hand. In late February 1943, Allied intelligence intercepted Japanese communications revealing a massive convoy operation, Operation 81. 8 troop transports, escorted by destroyers, were preparing to move more than 6,000 soldiers from Rabaul to Lae, reinforcing Japanese positions in New Guinea. If the convoy arrived intact, Allied ground forces would face a reinforced enemy dug deep into jungle terrain, an almost impossible fight. This was the moment skip bombing had been waiting for. Training intensified rapidly. Crews practiced attacks over water at dangerously low altitude. They learned to release bombs seconds before impact. Timing was everything. Too high, and the bomb plunged uselessly. Too low, and the aircraft risked catastrophe. Aircraft were modified. B-25 Mitchell bombers had their noses packed with forward-firing machine guns, allowing pilots to strafe decks before releasing bombs, suppressing gunners in the final seconds of approach. Skepticism remained, but time ran out. The convoy was moving. On March 2, 1943, Allied aircraft began shadowing Japanese ships as they passed through the Bismarck Sea. Weather delayed the decisive strike, buying both sides time. Japanese commanders believed they were safe. They had air cover. They had escorts. They believed bombers would attack from altitude like always. They were wrong. On March 3, 1943, the attack began. Wave after wave of Allied aircraft descended, not from the clouds, but from just above the waves. First came high-altitude bombers, deliberately drawing anti-aircraft fire upward. Japanese gunners tilted their weapons skyward, tracking familiar threats. Then, suddenly, the horizon filled with aircraft flying directly at the ships. B-25s roared in at mast height, guns blazing. Tracers stitched across decks. Crewmen dove for cover. In the final seconds, bombs were released, skipping across the water like stones, slamming into hulls, exploding at the waterline. Transports erupted in flame. One ship after another was struck, immobilized, burning, sinking. Destroyers attempted evasive maneuvers, but found themselves trapped, their formations shattered. Allied aircraft attacked relentlessly throughout the day. When ships slowed or stopped, they were finished with follow-up strikes. By nightfall, the convoy was annihilated. All 8 transports were sunk. 4 destroyers were destroyed. An estimated 3,000 Japanese soldiers were killed at sea. Allied losses were minimal by comparison. Skip bombing had worked, not as a gamble, but as a doctrine. The impact was immediate. Low-level attack training spread rapidly through Allied air units in the Pacific. Bombing manuals were revised. New aircraft designs emphasized forward firepower. Crews were trained to think aggressively, not passively. Japanese naval planners were stunned. They had prepared for torpedoes. They had prepared for high-altitude bombing. They had not prepared for bombers that attacked like predators skimming the surface. The hunters had adapted. And now, Japanese shipping would never again move without fear, no matter how close it hugged the coast. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea did not end on March 3, 1943. For the Japanese, it continued as a nightmare for days. As burning transports slipped beneath the waves, thousands of soldiers, many wounded, many unable to swim, were cast into open water. Japanese destroyers attempted rescue operations, but Allied aircraft returned again and again, strafing lifeboats and wreckage. Not out of cruelty, but out of brutal military logic, survivors would eventually become reinforcements if allowed to escape. It was a grim calculus of war. For Allied aircrews, the battle became a proving ground for the most dangerous form of aerial attack they had ever attempted. Pilots flew repeated low-level sorties, sometimes attacking the same target multiple times in a single day. Smoke obscured vision. Debris littered the sea. Oil slicks burned on the surface, sending black columns into the sky that could be seen for miles. Anti-aircraft fire was relentless. Japanese gunners, once caught off guard, adapted quickly. Ships fired point blank. Tracers ripped past cockpits. Several Allied aircraft were hit, damaged, or forced to ditch. But the damage had already been done. Each sinking compounded the chaos. Convoys lost formation. Escorts abandoned protection roles to rescue survivors. Command and control collapsed. By March 4, the Bismarck Sea was a graveyard. Japanese records later confirmed the loss of all 8 transports, carrying approximately 900 troops, along with 4 destroyers. Very few of the soldiers intended to reinforce Leh ever reached land. For the Japanese army, the loss was catastrophic. These were not expendable units. Many were trained veterans destined for frontline combat in New Guinea, an area where Japan already struggled to maintain supply lines against Allied air superiority. The consequences were immediate. Japanese ground forces at Leh would now fight without reinforcements, without sufficient ammunition, and without reliable resupply. Within months, Allied land campaigns would push them back relentlessly. But the battle's significance extended far beyond New Guinea. For Allied commanders, skip bombing was no longer experimental. It was decisive. Within weeks, similar low-level attack tactics were used across the Southwest Pacific. Shipping lanes once considered safe became death traps. Japanese commanders were forced to move convoys at night, disperse formations, and reduce loads, slowing logistics to a crawl. The air-sea balance had shifted. Aircraft were no longer just spotters or harassment tools against ships. They were executioners. The destruction of the Bismarck Sea convoy marked a strategic turning point in the Pacific War. From that moment on, Japan could no longer move large bodies of troops by sea without suffering devastating losses. The concept of mass reinforcement, once central to Japanese strategy, became increasingly untenable. Shipping statistics reveal the shift. After March 1943, Japanese troop transport operations declined sharply. Smaller convoys replaced large ones. Routes were lengthened and rerouted. Supply shipments became fragmented and unreliable. Each adaptation came at a cost. Longer routes meant more fuel consumption, something Japan could no longer afford. Smaller shipments meant fewer troops arriving where they were needed most. Defensive escorts were spread thin, reducing effectiveness everywhere. Allied air power exploited this relentlessly. Skip bombing became part of a broader system of interdiction. Low-level attacks were combined with medium-altitude bombing, torpedoes, and later, long-range fighters. Japanese shipping faced danger at every altitude. At every hour, enemy commanders took note. Post-war Japanese naval assessments described the Bismarck Sea defeat as a disaster beyond recovery. It exposed a fatal vulnerability in Japan's logistical lifeline and demonstrated that air power had become the dominant force at sea. For the Allies, the lesson was equally profound. Innovation did not always require new machines. Sometimes, it required new thinking, using existing weapons in unexpected ways. Skip bombing did not replace torpedoes or high-altitude bombing. It complemented them. It forced the enemy to defend against multiple threats simultaneously, overwhelming limited resources. In strategic terms, it accelerated Japan's isolation. Isolated armies starved, isolated bases fell, and isolated command structures made fatal decisions in the fog of war. After the war, skip bombing faded quietly into history. Jet aircraft, guided munitions, and missile technology transformed air-sea combat. Precision replaced daring. Distance replaced proximity. But the philosophy behind skip bombing never disappeared. Modern doctrines emphasizing low-altitude penetration, suppression of defenses, and shock-based strikes trace their lineage back to these early experiments. The idea that surprise and audacity could compensate for risk remains foundational in military aviation. The men who pioneered skip bombing were not celebrated immediately. Pilots like Paul Gunn returned to obscurity, their contributions overshadowed by larger battles and famous generals. Their innovation had been born of necessity, not formal approval. Yet history has been kinder. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea is now studied in military academies as a case study in adaptive warfare. How rigid doctrine can fail, and how flexibility can decide campaigns. It stands as a reminder that technology alone does not win wars. People do. This story began with failure. Bombs that missed, convoys that survived, a war that refused to follow the rules written before it began. Skip bombing was not born from confidence. It was born from frustration, from pilots watching enemy ships sail away again and again, untouched. The solution demanded everything aviators were trained not to do. Fly lower, get closer, risk more, and when the moment came, throw the bomb, not from safety, but from point-blank range. At the Bismarck Sea, that gamble changed the war. An entire convoy was erased. A campaign was weakened. A strategic assumption collapsed. Japanese commanders learned that the sea was no longer a shield, even close to shore. But beyond the statistics lies something deeper. Young aircrews trusted an idea that had never been fully tested. Commanders accepted losses in pursuit of a necessary breakthrough. Men flew straight into gunfire, knowing that a single mistake meant death. This was not reckless bravery. It was adaptation under pressure. World War II was won not only by factories and fleets, but by individuals who refused to accept failure as inevitable, who looked at an impossible problem and asked a different question. What if we fight the war differently? If you enjoy deep, narrative-driven World War II history, stories that go beyond famous names and reveal how innovation and human decisions shaped the war, make sure to like this video and subscribe. These episodes are built from combat reports, pilot memoirs, and archival research to bring you the moments that changed history quietly, but decisively. Tell us in the comments which forgotten WWII innovation should we cover next. A covert sabotage mission, a desperate naval gamble, a single decision that altered an entire campaign. New stories are coming, each uncovering how wars are really won.